the virtue of absolute certainty, unwavering loyalty, and the Führerprinzip, leader principle, that demanded blind obedience to authority. In the camps, German prisoners encountered a different model, a society that operated on debate. Negotiation, January 17, 1945, Camp Butner, North Carolina. The transport truck rattled to a stop beneath a canopy of winter-bare oak trees. Inside, 23 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their field-grey uniforms now faded to the color of ash, their eyes hollow from the Atlantic crossing. Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann pressed his forehead against the cold metal slat, watching his breath cloud in the frigid morning air. He had expected barbed wire and watchtowers, those he could see through the gaps in the canvas. What he did not expect was the smell drifting through the January wind, fresh bread baking somewhere beyond the gates, and something sweeter. Something that reminded him distantly of childhood summers in Bavaria before the world caught fire. The doors swung open. American guards stood at attention, their uniforms crisp, their faces neither cruel nor kind, merely professional. One of them, a sergeant with a Missouri drawl, gestured toward the camp entrance. "Welcome to the United States," he said in careful textbook German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Hartmann descended from the truck, his boots crunching on gravel still dusted with morning frost. As he passed through the gate, he noticed something that made him pause mid-step. A group of prisoners, Germans like himself, playing volleyball in a recreation yard. They were laughing. One of them waved. Hartmann felt something inside him crack, just slightly, the first fissure in the certainty. He had carried across an ocean the story of what happened to German prisoners of war on American soil between 1942 and 1946 is not merely a footnote in the vast chronicle of the Second World War. It is a narrative that strikes at the heart of ideological warfare, at the fundamental clash between visions of human society that sent 70 million people to their graves. These men, over 370,000 German soldiers captured in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany itself, arrived in the United States expecting the treatment they had been taught to anticipate from their enemies. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years constructing an image of America as a mongrel nation, weak and decadent, its people corrupted by democracy and racial mixing, its soldiers cowardly, its society on the brink of collapse. The prisoners who stepped off trains in Texas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and 44 other states carried these beliefs like armor, the last protection against the reality of their defeat. But America in the 1940s was not the America of Nazi fever dreams. It was a nation transformed by total war into the arsenal of democracy. Its factories running 3 shifts, its fields producing surplus enough to feed half of Europe. Its culture, that peculiar mixture of immigrant traditions, frontier optimism, and democratic idealism, ascendant and confident. The prisoners who arrived expecting degradation and brutality found instead something far more unsettling to their worldview. They found abundance, order, fairness, and a society that seemed to function not despite its diversity, but because of it. What followed was not merely imprisonment, but a profound psychological collision between ideology and lived experience, between what these men had been taught to believe and what they could see, taste, touch, and hear with their own senses. The first shock came within hours of arrival. At Camp Como, Mississippi, a Wehrmacht corporal named Ernst Frolich stood in line at the camp mess hall, his metal tray extended, expecting the thin gruel and black bread that had sustained the German army through its final desperate years. Instead, an American cook, a black sergeant from Alabama, ladled thick beef stew onto his plate, added mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, 2 slices of white bread, and then, almost as an afterthought, a square of chocolate cake. Frolich stared at the tray. In the final months before his capture near Aachen, his unit's rations had dwindled to watery soup and ersatz bread made from sawdust and chestnuts. Officers had taken the best portions while enlisted men foraged for roots. Here in the camp of his enemies, he held more food than he had seen in 6 months. He looked up at the cook, searching for mockery or cruelty in the man's face, but found only professional indifference. The sergeant was already serving the next man in line. This was not an isolated incident. Across America's network of prisoner-of-war camps, the pattern repeated with devastating psychological effect. The daily caloric intake for German POWs in American custody averaged approximately 3,000 calories, more than American civilians received under wartime rationing, and nearly double what German civilians were consuming in the collapsing Reich. The menu varied by region and season, but the abundance remained constant. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, oatmeal, toast with real butter, coffee with sugar and cream. Lunch brought sandwiches made with actual meat, apples, oranges trucked in from California. Dinner featured roasted chicken, pork chops, beef stew, always with fresh vegetables, always with dessert. On Sundays, many camps served turkey or ham. The prisoners reacted with confusion, suspicion, and eventually a kind of cognitive dissonance that their Nazi indoctrination could not explain. Lieutenant Reinhard Pabel, captured in Italy and sent to Camp Phillips in Kansas, later wrote in his memoir, "We had been told that America was starving, that the British blockade had been turned against them, that their mongrel population was too weak and divided to sustain a war effort. Yet here we were, prisoners, eating better than we had eaten as conquerors in France. Every meal was an indictment of everything we had been taught. The food was not just sustenance, it was evidence. It spoke of industrial capacity, agricultural surplus, logistical sophistication, and perhaps most disturbing to Nazi ideology, it spoke of a society that could afford to treat even its enemies with abundance. But the food itself was only the beginning of a deeper revelation. Within the camps, a parallel world emerged, one governed by rules that contradicted everything the prisoners had learned about American weakness and chaos. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, was followed with meticulous attention by American authorities, not out of sentimentality, but out of strategic calculation and genuine belief in international law. German officers were housed separately from enlisted men, maintaining military hierarchy. Prisoners were required to work, as the convention allowed, but only on non-military projects, agriculture, forestry, road construction, and they were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, which they could spend in camp canteens stocked with toiletries, tobacco, candy, and writing materials. They could send and receive mail, heavily censored but reliable. They had access to medical care that in many cases exceeded what German civilians were receiving in the bombed cities of the Reich. The prisoners quickly learned that the American system, for all its democratic informality, functioned with a kind of impersonal fairness that was foreign to their experience of Nazi hierarchy, where favoritism, brutality, and arbitrary authority were routine. At Camp Hearn in Texas, a group of prisoners filed a formal complaint about the quality of the bread, claiming it was too soft and lacked the substance of proper German bread. The camp commander, Colonel Isaac Curtis, convened a meeting, heard their grievances, and arranged for the camp bakery to produce a denser, darker loaf that better suited German tastes. The prisoners were astonished. The system they discovered had mechanisms for redress, for negotiation, for acknowledging individual preferences. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented a fundamental difference in how societies could be organized. And then there was the ice cream. If any single element symbolized the shocking abundance of American captivity, it was ice cream, that quintessentially American indulgence, that frozen embodiment of surplus dairy production, industrial refrigeration, and cultural frivolity that Nazi ideology would have dismissed as decadent. Ice cream appeared in the camps with startling regularity. Some facilities had their own ice cream machines. Others received deliveries from local dairies. On the 4th of July, many camps served ice cream as part of celebration meals that included hot dogs, hamburgers, and watermelon. for prisoners from a nation where sugar, cream, and fuel had been rationed to near extinction, where every resource was devoted to total war. The casual abundance of ice cream was almost incomprehensible. Gefreiter Wolfgang Kluge, a 22-year-old infantryman captured in Normandy and sent to Camp Stark in New Hampshire, encountered ice cream for the first time on a sweltering August afternoon in 1944. The camp guards distributed cups of vanilla ice cream to prisoners working on a nearby farm, harvesting potatoes under the hot sun. Klug took a spoonful and stopped working. The cold sweetness, the richness of the cream, the casual generosity of the gesture, it overwhelmed him. He sat down on the edge of the potato field and wept, great racking sobs that he could not control. Later, when a fellow prisoner asked why, Klug struggled to explain. "I was not crying from gratitude," he said. "I was crying because I realized that everything we had been told was a lie. If they had lied about this, what else had they lied about?" This psychological transformation, what some historians have called the ice cream effect, was precisely what American authorities hoped to achieve through their treatment of German POWs. The policy was not accidental or merely humanitarian. It was strategic re-education through lived experience. The Special Projects Division of the U.S. Army, working in collaboration with the Office of War Information, developed a comprehensive program designed to expose prisoners to American democracy, abundance, and culture with the goal of undermining their faith in Nazi ideology and preparing them for eventual return to a defeated Germany as potential democratic citizens. The program operated on a simple premise. You cannot argue people out of deeply held beliefs, but you can create experiences that make those beliefs untenable. The movies came next. In camps across America, outdoor screens were erected in recreation yards, projectors set up in mess halls and auditoriums. The film program began cautiously, with documentaries about American geography and industry, films showing the vastness of wheat fields in Kansas, the assembly lines of Detroit, the bridges of San Francisco. But it quickly expanded to include Hollywood entertainment, westerns starring John Wayne and Gary Cooper, comedies with Abbott and Costello, even sophisticated dramas like Casablanca and The Grapes of Wrath. The goal was dual: to show the productive capacity and cultural vitality of America, and to provide prisoners with a glimpse of a society that valued individual freedom, social mobility, and democratic values, however imperfectly realized. For many prisoners, the movies were their first sustained exposure to American culture beyond propaganda caricatures. They saw black actors and white actors appearing together on screen, not in the master-servant relationships that Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect, but as colleagues, friends, sometimes even romantic interests. They saw depictions of American democracy that were critical and self-reflective. The Grapes of Wrath showed American poverty and social injustice, yet it had been produced by American studios and celebrated by American audiences. This capacity for self-criticism, for public acknowledgement of national shortcomings, was utterly foreign to men who had lived under a totalitarian regime where doubt was treason and criticism was death. Obergefreiter Friedrich Schiller, a veteran of the Afrika Korps, captured at El Alamein and sent to Camp Chaffee in Arkansas, attended his first movie, screening in December 1943. The film was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Frank Capra's, a 1939 paean to democratic idealism and individual conscience against political corruption. Schiller, who had joined the Hitler Youth at age 10 and had never known any system but National Socialism, watched with growing confusion as the story unfolded. A lone senator, naive and idealistic, fighting against entrenched power, ultimately succeeding through persistence and faith in democratic institutions. The film suggested that individuals could challenge authority, that systems could be changed from within, that power could be questioned and resisted. These ideas were revolutionary to men who had been taught that the Führer's will was absolute, that questioning was weakness, that the individual existed only to serve the state. After the screening, Schiller returned to his barracks in silence. Later that night, he wrote in a letter to his wife in Berlin, a letter that would be intercepted and read by American censors, as all prisoner mail was. Today I saw a film that confused me greatly. It showed a system where men can speak against their leaders without being shot. I do not know if this is American propaganda or American reality, but I confess that I would like to believe it is real. What have we become that such a thing seems like a fantasy? The letter never reached his wife. Berlin was already under Soviet siege. The mail system collapsed. But the censor who read it made a note in Schiller's file. Subject showing signs of ideological reorientation. Recommend continued exposure to democratic education materials. And then there was baseball. Of all the American cultural elements introduced to German prisoners of war, baseball proved the most bewildering and ultimately the most symbolically potent. The game made no sense to European minds trained on the logic of soccer. There were no draws, no ties, only winners and losers determined through a complex system of innings and outs that seemed designed to maximize suspense and uncertainty. Yet the camps organized baseball leagues with evangelical enthusiasm. Teams formed along national lines, the Tigers, the Yankees, the Giants. Prisoners adopted these American identities with surprising passion. Crude diamonds were carved out of camp recreation yards, bases marked with bags of sand. Bats fashioned from scrap lumber. The American guards encouraged this enthusiastically, even participating in games themselves, guards and prisoners sharing the same field. This casual mixing, this voluntary association between captor and captive, violated every premise of proper military hierarchy that German soldiers had been taught. In the Wehrmacht, officers did not fraternize with enlisted men. Superiors maintained strict social distance. Authority was absolute and unquestioned. Yet here were American sergeants pitching batting practice to German prisoners, arguing good-naturedly about whether a ball was fair or foul, celebrating together when someone hit a home run. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a prisoner named Hans Weber, a former panzer commander who had fought across France and Russia, discovered that he had a natural talent for pitching. He joined a camp team, learned the rules through trial and error and patient explanation from a guard named Earl Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa who had played semi-professional baseball before the war. Over the course of that summer of 1944, as Allied forces liberated France and pushed toward Germany, Weber and Johnson developed an unlikely friendship centered on their weekly baseball games. They could not discuss the war. Regulations forbade it, but they could discuss curveballs and batting stances, strategy and statistics. Years later, in a letter to a historian researching POW camps, Weber wrote, "Earl taught me baseball. But what he really taught me was that it was possible for men to compete without hatred, to have opponents without having enemies. In Germany, we were taught that life was struggle, that the world was divided into masters and slaves, victors and vanquished. Baseball showed me a different possibility, that struggle could be play, that competition could be friendly, that you could battle fiercely for 9 innings and then shake hands and share a beer." This seems simple, but for me it was revelation. It was the foundation of a different way of living. The baseball diamonds, the movie screens, the ice cream. These were the visible symbols of something deeper happening in the camps. Something that American authorities carefully orchestrated and documented. The re-education program, officially known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, expanded throughout 1944 and 1945 as the flow of prisoners increased following the invasion of Normandy and the collapse of German defenses. Special camps were established for prisoners deemed most susceptible to democratic re-education. Younger men, enlisted soldiers, those who showed skepticism about Nazi ideology. These facilities, including Fort Eustis in Virginia and Fort Getty in Rhode Island, intensified the exposure to American democracy through carefully curated newspapers. Magazines, books, lectures, and discussion groups. The centerpiece of this effort was Der Ruf, The Call, a newspaper produced by carefully screened anti-Nazi German prisoners under American supervision. The publication walked a delicate line. It had to be German enough in tone and content to be credible to its prisoner audience, yet subtly democratic in its values and perspective. Early issues focused on non-political topics, sports, literature, camp news, but gradually introduced more challenging content, articles about German responsibility for the war, accounts of Nazi atrocities, initially met with widespread disbelief, discussions of democratic governance and free press principles. Distribution was voluntary, but circulation grew steadily as prisoners discovered that Der Ruf provided more honest information about the war's progress than Nazi propaganda ever had. The newspaper became a forum for German prisoners to begin processing their complicity and their defeat. In 1945, as Germany collapsed and the full horror of the concentration camps was revealed through film footage and journalistic accounts, Der Ruf published testimonies and photographs that many prisoners initially rejected as Allied propaganda. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These men had fought for Germany, had believed in the righteousness of their cause, had sacrificed years of their lives to a struggle they were told was existential. To accept that their leaders had been mass murderers, that their war had been criminal, that their ideology had been evil. This required a dismantling of self that many could not bear. Yet gradually, painfully, cracks appeared in the collective denial. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs were real. The survivors testified, and simultaneously, the prisoners' own experience in American captivity provided an alternative model. They had been treated fairly when they expected brutality. They had been given abundance when they expected starvation. They had been exposed to information when they expected propaganda. The contrast between Nazi promises and American reality became impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Walter Schmidt, an ardent Nazi captured in the Battle of the Bulge, underwent a transformation that his camp file documented in remarkable detail. Upon arrival at Camp Como in January 1945, Schmidt was classified as a Hitler fanatic, hostile, uncooperative, dismissive of American culture and power. He organized resistance among prisoners to the re-education program, circulated clandestine Nazi newsletters, enforced ideological discipline through intimidation. But over months of exposure to camp life, to movies and newspapers, to the simple human decency of guards who treated him with respect even when he showed none in return, something shifted. The turning point came in April 1945. When Schmidt attended a mandatory screening of footage from the liberation of Buchenwald concentration camp. He watched in silence as the camera panned across the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the piles of corpses. When the lights came up, he stood and walked out of the auditorium without speaking. For 3 days he remained in his bunk, refusing food, speaking to no one. On the 4th day, he requested a meeting with the camp education officer, Captain Robert Hogan, and spoke for 2 hours. The contents of that conversation were noted in his file. Subject experiencing severe psychological crisis. Has requested materials on democracy and German responsibility for war crimes. Recommends isolation from remaining Nazi-identified prisoners. Appears to be genuine ideological conversion. Schmidt's transformation was not unique, though it was perhaps more dramatic than most. Studies conducted by American authorities during and after the war suggested that approximately 10 to 15% of German POWs underwent significant ideological shifts away from Nazism during their captivity, while another 30–40% developed moderate skepticism about Nazi claims and greater openness to democratic ideas. The remaining prisoners fell into 2 categories: those who maintained Nazi convictions, a minority that dwindled as evidence of German defeat and Nazi crimes mounted, and the largest group, men who had never been particularly ideological, who had fought because they were drafted and obeyed because they were soldiers, who now simply wanted to survive and return home. But even among this uncommitted majority, American captivity had effects. The small, daily experiences accumulated, the fair application of rules, the abundance of resources, the absence of arbitrary cruelty, the mixing of races and ethnicities in the guard units, the visible prosperity even in small American towns near the camps. These observations challenged the Nazi narrative of American decadence and weakness. When prisoners were taken under guard to work in civilian communities, harvesting crops, working in lumber mills, maintaining infrastructure, they saw ordinary American life. They saw small towns with churches and schools, farms with modern machinery, stores with full shelves despite wartime rationing. They saw women driving cars, children playing baseball, black and white workers laboring side by side. At Camp Trinidad in Colorado, a work detail of German prisoners was assigned to help with the beet harvest in the autumn of 1944. They lived in a satellite camp near a small farming community, working alongside local civilians, Mexican-American migrant workers, and Japanese-American citizens who had been released from internment camps to address wartime labor shortages. The German prisoners watched this peculiar American tableau with fascination, former enemies working together, different races and ethnicities mixing with casual ease, women doing men's work. The whole enterprise organized with minimal supervision and maximum efficiency. One prisoner, a former Nazi youth leader named Kurt Meissner, struck up a halting friendship with a Japanese-American worker named George Nakamura. The irony was not lost on either of them. Germany and Japan were allies. Yet here was Nakamura, an American citizen despite his ancestry, explaining to Meissner the basics of American democracy and why, despite being imprisoned by his own government in the hysteria after Pearl Harbor, he still believed in the American system. The difference, Nakamura explained in careful English while Meissner struggled to understand, is that Americans can admit mistakes, can fix mistakes. Democracy is not perfect, but it bends, it learns. Your Hitler, our emperor, they break before they bend. Meissner pondered this conversation for weeks. In letters home that would not be delivered until after the war, he wrote, "I have met an American who looks Japanese, but is as American as Roosevelt. His family was imprisoned, but now he works freely and argues that this proves American democracy works. I confess I do not fully understand this logic, but I am impressed by his faith. We were taught that democracies are weak because they allow dissent. Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps the ability to admit error and change course is not weakness but strength. This recognition that flexibility and self-criticism might be sources of power rather than weakness represented a fundamental challenge to Nazi ideology, which had preached compromise and the rule of law rather than the rule of men. It was messy and informal and sometimes inefficient, but it functioned. More importantly, it produced astonishing results: industrial output that dwarfed Germany's, military might that had turned the tide of war, and a standard of living that made German propaganda claims of American poverty and chaos laughable. The irony was that many German prisoners lived better in American captivity than they had as soldiers in their own army, and far better than their families lived in the collapsing Reich. As 1945 progressed and Germany was squeezed between advancing Soviet and Western Allied forces, letters from home, those that still arrived, painted increasingly desperate pictures of destruction, starvation, and chaos. Meanwhile, prisoners in Texas and Oklahoma and Alabama ate 3 meals a day, played sports, watched movies, and learned trades. The psychological burden of this reversal was immense. Guilt-compounded trauma, survivors' shame, mixed with the growing recognition that their service had been for a criminal regime. The churches played an unexpected role in this reckoning. Many camps had chaplains, both American military chaplains who spoke German and increasingly German POW priests and pastors who were identified among the prisoners and given permission to conduct services. These religious services became spaces where prisoners could begin to process their moral and psychological crises in a language and framework that felt culturally familiar. The message from these clergy, carefully monitored by camp authorities, emphasized themes of repentance, forgiveness, and moral responsibility. They created theological space for prisoners to acknowledge German crimes without complete psychological collapse. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a Catholic chaplain named Father Heinrich Müller, himself a prisoner who had served as a military chaplain in the Wehrmacht, preached a sermon in the spring of 1945 that was recorded by American intelligence officers. His text was from Romans, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." But his interpretation was revolutionary for his audience of German soldiers. "We must ask ourselves," Müller preached, "whether the authority we served was truly from God, or whether we committed the sin of obedience to evil. The commandment to obey authority is not absolute. When authority commands murder, when it demands participation in genocide, when it wages unjust war, then our higher obligation is to God's law and to conscience. We have failed in this obligation. We must now ask for forgiveness and commit ourselves to rebuilding a Germany that will never again commit such sins." The sermon caused significant controversy among the prisoners. A group of die-hard Nazis filed a formal complaint with camp authorities, demanding Müller's removal. But a larger number of prisoners, especially after viewing footage from liberated concentration camps, found in Müller's words a framework for moral reckoning. The church services became more crowded. Discussion groups formed. Men who had not thought seriously about religion or morality since childhood grappled with ultimate questions of guilt, responsibility, and redemption. This spiritual dimension of the POW experience is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on material conditions and re-education programs. But for many German prisoners, especially those who had been raised in Christian traditions before the Nazi period, religious faith provided the psychological resources to confront what their nation had done and what they had participated in. The abundance of American captivity, the food, the movies, the baseball, created cognitive dissonance with Nazi propaganda. But it was the moral reckoning enabled by religious reflection that allowed many prisoners to move beyond mere disillusionment to active rejection of Nazi ideology. The symbolic power of American abundance, particularly ice cream, took on almost sacramental significance in this context. Ice cream became not just a food, but a metaphor for the possibility of grace, for unearned favor, for the possibility of mercy in a harsh world. Prisoners who had expected punishment received instead a form of generosity that Nazi ideology had no framework to explain. The experience created what psychologists would later call positive moral shock, an encounter with goodness that challenges existing moral categories and creates openings for transformation. Feldwebel. Otto Krause, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front captured in France, described his first experience with ice cream in a letter written years after the war. "I remember thinking that if the Americans could give ice cream to their enemies, then perhaps everything we had been taught about the world was backward. Perhaps strength did not require cruelty. Perhaps prosperity did not require exploitation. Perhaps a nation could be great without being brutal." The ice cream was delicious, but the idea behind it was more nourishing than the food itself. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the mood in the camps shifted dramatically. Germany's surrender meant that prisoners were no longer soldiers in an active conflict, but rather remnants of a defeated regime, their status ambiguous, their future uncertain. The Nazi hierarchy within the camps collapsed as evidence of German atrocities mounted, and the Reich's complete defeat became undeniable. Some die-hard Nazis attempted to maintain discipline and ideological purity, but they were increasingly isolated. The majority of prisoners faced the question that would define their futures. What kind of Germany would they return to, and what kind of Germans would they be? The American re-education program intensified in this final phase. The Special Projects Division, working with German anti-Nazi prisoners and émigré intellectuals, developed comprehensive courses on democratic governance, free market economics, civil society, and constitutional law. Participation was voluntary, but thousands of prisoners enrolled, seeing practical value in understanding the system that had defeated them and that would now reshape their homeland. The courses were sophisticated and comprehensive, taught by German-speaking American officers and anti-Nazi German prisoners who had been screened and trained as instructors. At Fort Eustis, the main re-education center, prisoners studied the American Constitution, read the Federalist Papers in translation, debated the virtues and problems of parliamentary versus presidential systems, and examined case studies of democratic governance from Switzerland, Britain, and the United States. They were encouraged to critique democracy, to identify its flaws and contradictions. The racial segregation in the American South was a particular focus of discussion, with American instructors acknowledging this failure and discussing ongoing efforts at reform. The goal was not to present America as perfect, but as a functioning democracy that, despite serious flaws, provided mechanisms for peaceful change and protection of individual rights. The prisoners were also trained in practical skills for post-war reconstruction, democratic journalism, small business management, teaching methods for schools in a democratic society, even techniques for community organizing and civic participation. The American authorities, in coordination with occupation planners, envisioned these prisoners as potential seeds of democratic culture in post-war Germany. Not all prisoners were receptive, and many of those who participated did so for pragmatic rather than idealistic reasons. But the program created a cohort of German POWs who returned home with at least some exposure to democratic ideas and practices. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, with some prisoners not returning to Germany until 1947 due to logistical challenges and the need for labor in America's transition back to a peacetime economy. The prisoners left American camps with complex feelings: relief at returning home, anxiety about what they would find there, nostalgia for the security and abundance of captivity, and a complicated mixture of gratitude and resentment toward their former captors. Many carried with them gifts from American guards and local communities: clothing, tools, books, photographs. Some had addresses of American pen pals, arrangements for future correspondence, even tentative friendships. The final act of American generosity came at the moment of departure. As prisoners boarded ships for the return voyage to Europe, each was given a care package: canned goods, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, soap, valuable trade goods in the devastated German economy. And symbolically, each package included a small American flag and a pamphlet explaining the principles of democracy. It was a final act of re-education, a last message: you are not returning as our enemies, but as potential partners in building a peaceful, democratic future. The return to Germany was traumatic for most prisoners. The country they found bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, starving, traumatized. The Nazi Party was outlawed, its leaders dead or on trial at Nuremberg. Germany was divided into occupation zones, its sovereignty suspended, its future uncertain. For many returning POWs, the contrast with American abundance was overwhelming. After years of adequate food, comfortable barracks, and recreational activities, they returned to a landscape of rubble and desperation. Yet the seeds planted in the camps bore fruit in unexpected ways. Studies conducted decades later by German and American historians identified significant numbers of returning POWs who became active in democratic politics, civic organizations, education, and journalism in post-war Germany. Former prisoners helped establish local newspapers committed to free press principles. Others joined or founded political parties aligned with democratic values. Some became teachers who brought their experience of American democracy into German classrooms. The direct causal link is difficult to establish with certainty. Post-war Germany was shaped by many forces, but the pattern suggests that for at least some prisoners, the American captivity experience had lasting effects. Friedrich Schiller, the prisoner who had been so moved by Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, returned to his hometown in Bavaria in 1946 to find it devastated by bombing and occupied by American forces. He secured work as a translator for the American military government, then as a journalist for a local newspaper founded with American support. In a letter to the camp commander at Camp Chaffee, written in 1949, Schiller reflected, "When I remember Arkansas, I remember ice cream on Sunday afternoons and movies under the stars, and the feeling that even as a prisoner, I was treated as a human being with dignity. These memories seem like a dream now when I look at the ruins around me. But they also give me hope. If we can rebuild Germany with the same spirit of abundance and fairness that I experienced in your camp, then perhaps something good can come from this catastrophe." Not all stories ended so hopefully. Many prisoners returned to find their families dead, their homes destroyed, their old lives irretrievable. The psychological burden of defeat, combined with exposure to evidence of Nazi crimes and the moral complexity of their own participation, led some to despair. Suicide rates among returning POWs were significant, though precise statistics are difficult to obtain. Others retreated into silence, never speaking of their war experiences or their time in American camps, burying those memories along with their Nazi pasts. The majority simply tried to survive, to rebuild their lives in whatever way possible, to forget and to move forward. Yet the broader historical impact of the POW experience transcends individual stories. The treatment of German prisoners in American camps represented a deliberate experiment in ideological transformation through humane treatment and exposure to democratic values. It was unprecedented in scale and ambition. No nation had ever attempted to systematically re-educate hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners while maintaining their humane treatment. According to international law, the experiment was imperfect and incomplete. Many prisoners were not significantly affected by re-education efforts. The camps were not free from problems. There were incidents of violence, abuse, and mismanagement. Some American guards harbored deep hatred for Germans and acted on it despite regulations. Moreover, the entire program was stained by the profound contradiction at its heart. America was teaching democracy and equality to German prisoners in camps located in states where racial segregation was legal and enforced, where black Americans were denied basic civil rights, where the same military that operated POW camps with scrupulous attention to international law had incarcerated Japanese American citizens without due process. German prisoners noticed these contradictions. The smarter ones asked pointed questions about how America could preach equality while practicing segregation. American instructors struggled with these challenges, some acknowledging the hypocrisy, others defending American democracy as a work in progress, still others changing the subject. Yet even with these profound limitations, the POW camp experience represented something historically significant. It demonstrated that ideology could be challenged through lived experience, that minds shaped by totalitarian propaganda could be opened through exposure to alternative ways of organizing society, that even enemies could be treated with dignity, and that such treatment could have strategic value beyond mere morality. The camps were laboratories for the broader project of post-war reconstruction, testing techniques and approaches that would be applied to occupied Germany and Japan. The lessons learned in the camps, both successes and failures, informed occupation policies, denazification programs, and the broader strategy of integrating former enemies into a democratic international order. The ice cream, the movies, the baseball, these symbols of American abundance and culture, carried ideological weight because they were embedded in a larger experience of fairness, order, and respect. A prisoner could dismiss any single element. Ice cream was just dessert, movies were entertainment, baseball was a silly game. But the totality of the experience was harder to dismiss. The cumulative effect of thousands of small interactions, observations, and experiences gradually eroded the certainties that Nazi propaganda had constructed. Not completely, not for everyone, but enough to matter. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and integrated into the democratic West, the story of German POWs in America faded from public memory. It was overshadowed by larger narratives: the Holocaust, the Allied victory, the Marshall Plan, the Cold War. German prisoners who had experienced American captivity rarely spoke about it publicly. The subject was complicated, tinged with shame about defeat and guilt about Nazi crimes. American veterans who had guarded POW camps also remained largely silent, their service less heroic than combat, their stories less compelling than tales of battlefield glory. But in recent decades, historians have recovered this forgotten chapter and examined its significance. Archives have been opened, memoirs published, oral histories recorded. The picture that emerges is complex and nuanced. The American treatment of German POWs was neither purely humanitarian nor purely strategic. It was both, a mixture of practical calculations and genuine idealism, of geopolitical maneuvering and sincere belief in democratic values. It represented America at a particular historical moment, confident in its power, abundant in resources, idealistic about its mission, yet still wrestling with profound internal contradictions. For the German prisoners who lived through it, the American captivity experience remained a reference point, a memory of a time when they encountered a society fundamentally different from both Nazi Germany and war-torn Europe. Whether that encounter changed them, and how permanently, varied from individual to individual. But the possibility of transformation was real, demonstrated in thousands of cases where ideology yielded to experience, where hatred softened to understanding, where certainty gave way to questioning. The recurring symbol through all these stories is ice cream, that simple, sweet, cold treat that represented something far larger than itself. In the burning summer of 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and V-2 rockets fell on London, German prisoners in Oklahoma and Texas ate ice cream and tried to make sense of a world that no longer matched their expectations. They had been told that America was weak, divided, morally bankrupt. They had been told that democracy was chaos and that abundance was a lie. The ice cream, melting in the summer heat, its sweetness lingering on their tongues, was undeniable physical evidence that what they had been taught was false. Ice cream became a metonym for the entire American experience. Abundant, generous, a bit frivolous perhaps, but undeniably real. It represented a society wealthy enough to produce surplus cream and sugar even during total war, sophisticated enough to freeze and distribute it across vast distances, and confident enough to share it with enemies. Every spoonful was an argument without words, a proof that could not be denied. And for many prisoners, ice cream triggered a cascade of questioning that ultimately undermined everything they had believed about the world, about America, about themselves. In this way, the mundane became profound. Baseball games on dusty Oklahoma fields taught lessons about cooperation and fair play. Movie nights under the stars offered glimpses of a society comfortable with dissent and self-criticism. The simple daily experience of being treated fairly, of eating well, of being addressed with basic human respect, these experiences, accumulated into a worldview challenging, education more powerful than any lecture or pamphlet could provide. The German prisoners who returned home in 1946 and 1947 carried these memories with them. Some rejected what they had seen, clinging to Nazi ideology or retreating into cynicism. But many others carried forward, consciously or unconsciously, lessons learned in those unlikely classrooms of barbed wire and baseball diamonds. They built the Federal Republic of Germany, taught its children, wrote its newspapers, staffed its bureaucracies, and voted in its elections. How much of post-war Germany's successful democratic transformation can be attributed to the POW camp experience is impossible to calculate precisely. But the experience was part of the story, one thread in the complex tapestry of post-war reconstruction. The deeper truth that the POW camp experience illuminated is this: ideology is powerful, but it is not impervious to reality. Humans can be taught to believe almost anything, but sustained exposure to contrary evidence creates cognitive dissonance that eventually demands resolution. The Nazi propaganda that shaped German soldiers' worldviews was sophisticated and pervasive, reinforced by years of education, media saturation, and social pressure. Yet it could not withstand the accumulated weight of lived experience that contradicted its claims. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the ice cream, the movies, and the baseball. They were not just amenities or entertainment. They were arguments in a battle of ideas, evidence presented not through rhetoric, but through experience. They said, here is abundance in a democracy. Here is culture produced by a free society. Here is cooperation without coercion. Here is a different way of organizing human life. Judge for yourself. And thousands of prisoners, standing in mess hall lines with trays full of food, sitting in outdoor theaters watching American movies, running the bases in dusty baseball diamonds, did judge for themselves. Their judgments were complex and varied. Some rejected what they saw, clinging to familiar certainties. Others converted with the fervor of believers discovering truth. Most fell somewhere between, confused, ambivalent, but fundamentally shaken in their prior convictions. The American gamble was that this shaking of convictions mattered, that it would plant seeds of doubt about totalitarianism and openness to democracy that might eventually flower in post-war Germany. It was an experiment in soft power before that term existed, an attempt to win hearts and minds not through propaganda, but through demonstration, not through argument, but through example. The ice cream was real, the movies were real, the baseball was real. In a world saturated with lies and propaganda, that reality had revolutionary potential. As the last ships carrying repatriated German prisoners departed New York Harbor in 1947, as the camps were dismantled and converted back to their original purposes or abandoned, the experiment ended. But its effects rippled forward through time, carried in the memories and changed perspectives of men who had expected cruelty and found abundance, who had expected chaos and found order, who had expected confirmation of their prejudices and found instead evidence that demanded reconsideration. Not all of them rose to that demand, but enough did that the story matters, that the ice cream and the movies and the baseball transcended their apparent triviality to become symbols of a larger truth about the power of humane treatment and democratic values to challenge even the most entrenched ideologies. In the end, the story of German POWs in American camps is not just a curious footnote to World War II. It is a case study in the power of lived experience to transform belief, a demonstration that ideology, even ideology backed by years of propaganda and enforced by totalitarian power, can be challenged through exposure to alternative realities. It is a reminder that abundance matters not just materially, but symbolically, that how a society treats even its enemies reveals something fundamental about its values, and that small acts of generosity, a cup of ice cream on a hot summer day, can carry meanings far beyond their immediate material significance. The prisoners who tasted ice cream in Texas and Oklahoma, who watched movies under stars in Arkansas and Kansas, who played baseball in Colorado and North Carolina, encountered more than American hospitality. They encountered evidence of a different possible world, one that their ideology insisted could not exist. Some rejected that evidence, but others, sitting in the summer heat with ice cream melting in their hands, began to wonder if everything they had been taught was a lie. And in that wondering, in that small opening of doubt, lay the possibility of transformation, personal, political, historical. The ice cream was just ice cream, but it was also an argument, a promise, and a challenge. And for those prisoners willing to receive it, it was the beginning of a new understanding of what human society could be.